Hello, welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect PT, and I am joined today with Melissa Ostroff from Earthworks. Thank you so much for joining us today, Melissa. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background about Melissa, this is actually not the first time she's been on one of our Lunch and Learns, so we're really excited to have her back. But Melissa is the Pennsylvania Policy and Field Advocate for Earthworks, where she leverages the optical gas imaging technology, which we're going to talk about, to respond to community concerns, inform policy, and ensure public health and environmental protection are prioritized in our state. She is a public health professional and driven by the critical need to hold industry and government accountable to communities and to the scientific evidence. So thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jillian. It's good to be back.
Yeah. It's we have a really good presentation for everybody. We're gonna talk a lot about today. If you smell it, report it. And really recently, Melissa and I and others were out in the field, and we noticed some smells, and this topic came up as a result of that work. So we wanted to really, kind of share that knowledge and information with other people. So as you're walking in the woods and as you're, taking your dog for a walk, or if you live around one of the oil and gas wells that are in Pennsylvania and other states, I think this could apply. What do you do if you smell something? And so that's really what we're going to go over today. And so we're hoping to share with you this important information that you can use in your own community to make positive change. If thank you to our folks on the back end. We have Corey on tech today, and Chelsea's also with us helping put together the presentation. So we're going to go ahead to the next slide. And so this is a little bit about Earthworks and who Earthworks is. They're a nonprofit committed to protecting communities and the environment from the harms of oil and gas extraction. And so they partner with communities, community members, and organizations like ours to respond to the threat of public health and climate, often through this technology we're going to talk about. So Melissa, tell me a little bit about the gas imaging technology, the camera that you use, and I think that's on the next screen, right?
Yeah, I think so. So I use a very special technology that really, other than nonprofits like Earthworks, and there's not many others out there that have it. It's really the industry and regulatory agencies that make use of this. It's called an optical gas imaging camera. The specific model we use is made by a company called FLIR. It's the GF320 model. It's designed to be able to make normally invisible pollution visible. And it's specifically calibrated for the kind of pollution that comes from oil and gas. So typically, you're going to see methane pollution. That's one type of hydrocarbon, but there will also be health hazardous pollutants that are also released with the methane. These are volatile organic compounds, things like benzene that folks may have heard of. This camera is able to actually see those invisible pollutants. And so it allows us to look at oil and gas sites and to see things that, we're standing there, we're looking at it. We don't see anything. We might smell something, as we'll talk about, but we're not seeing anything. But when you look through the lens of this camera, you can not only see the pollution, but you can see where it's coming from. And that allows inspectors, and ideally, it would allow operators to identify problems with their equipment and to fix it at the source. So it's a very powerful piece of equipment.
Yeah, and so we used this just recently. You had it out with when we were looking around the Plum and Oakmont area, and we're going to talk. And I think there's actually a video a little later in the presentation of some of the actually what this camera will show us, which is super cool. I think it's really neat. But tell us a little bit about this gas imaging. Optical gas imaging in terms that are created by agencies like the EPA.
Yeah, I think we might have on the next slide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So basically, this technology is listed under the EPA Federal Register as lawful to be used for oil and gas leak detection. And in fact, it's listed as one of the alternative work practices for detecting leaks from equipment. And so it is not only EPA approved, but recommended for use for finding gas leaks or finding emissions coming from the oil and gas sector. And so I was certified as an optical gas imaging thermographer by the same organization that provides that certification to EPA inspectors as well as to oil and gas operators who make use of this technology. We have advocated, Earthworks as an organization to see this technology used in a more widespread way. We believe that it's one of the best ways to conduct an oil and gas inspection, ideally combined with other methods, but there's really nothing that can replace this technology when it comes to making normally invisible pollution from oil and gas visible and kind of identifying the source of the problem. This is very specific in that way.
And so if we go to the next slide, what are we talking about here, Melissa?
Yeah, so we don't have to get too in the weeds with it, but just to create a better sense of the technology behind this camera, it is a sort of a subtype of infrared camera. So it's specifically calibrated to a part of the electromagnetic spectrum where hydrocarbons like methane, like benzene, are visible. So there are, of course, things that we can see with the naked eye that fall in one part of the electromagnetic spectrum. There are things that fall under like microwave, for example, X-rays, and then there's a part of the electromagnetic spectrum where methane, you could say, lives. And so this camera is able to see things that live in that part of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's what makes it different from just your average ordinary camera, or even from other infrared or devices that are sold by the same company.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you see it for the first time. I remember I was like, I cannot believe how like you can see this plume. And I think we were at a compressor station in Murraysville, and we could smell something.
Yeah.
And then just to see how far that plume went was pretty shocking. And the fact that this camera could pick up that plume and how far it went, it was pretty amazing. So this is, I think, really essential technology to be able to see what we're really breathing, because sometimes we just don't know. I often get the question, so is methane odorless? And we hear about oil and gas companies have to add odorant to the natural gas that you smell in your home, if you don't have the pilot light on or something like that. Can you kind of explain to us a little bit more about air pollution and methane, and what are we talking about when we're talking about smell here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's true. Methane itself is odorless. And so you might think that, when you go to a site and there's a methane leak or there are methane emissions, you might expect to see something, but not to smell something. But almost every time that I've looked through the camera and found a plume of pollution, I've also smelled something. In this case, because I'm typically looking at like production end equipment, so looking at like well sites or looking at midstream equipment like compressor stations, at that point of the process, they're not adding in the mercaptan. That would be later on, like when it reaches your home or in the distribution lines. So the smell that you're noticing when you're at a well site, if something's going wrong or if it's venting, that is actually not the methane itself. It's the pollutants that come up with the methane. So we talk about that a bit in this slide, but also in the mix with methane are things like benzene, ethylbenzene, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide, which would have that sulfuric odor that, just a stinky kind of smell to it, very potent. So the things that come up alongside methane that it sort of brings with it, that's what you're smelling, but it's a good indicator that it's probably not just those pollutants, but also methane. They come together. They're not generally being emitted just like one at a time.
Right.
Um, Methane in and of itself, while it may be odorless, as we note here, it's terrible for the climate. It's something that's scientists have come to understand and share with the public that over the short term, it's actually 86 times worse for the climate than carbon dioxide. And so, this pollution is concerning in terms of climate issues, but also health impacts that come along with the methane in the form of these other pollutants, which can irritate the respiratory system, causing things like asthma, contributing to poor birth outcomes, which can have lifelong implications. We know that there's an association with blood cancers, and more recent studies have shown even lower life expectancy. So the methane and the other health hazardous pollutants go hand in hand, and they have different impacts. But it's more the health hazardous pollutants that contribute to the smell, I
Hmm.
would say.
Yeah, so it sounds like two main concerns here. One is obviously the climate, and methane's contribution to the climate situation getting worse, but also these health impacts. And I know we see this up on the screen here, but even short-term exposure. The first time I went to visit that compressor station, um, we I went there to actually set up noise monitoring equipment, because that's one of the monitoring that we do here at Protect PT that's unique. And because the resident that was living there mentioned there's a horrible smell and there's a horrible sound, and they wanted, at the time, they wanted to expand the compressor station. So their concern was that it's going to get worse, the smell is going to get worse, and the noise is going to get worse. And so we went there to kind of measure a baseline, and boy, just from being there for half an hour setting up that equipment, I had the worst headache, and this really just like in the back of my throat, like chemical taste. So even short-term exposure, I think, can be, harmful. And actually, the resident ended up calling the DEP, and they found 11 leaks on the site.
Wow.
Yeah, and then we went back, right, and we've like
Yeah.
twice we've gone back and we found leaks and emissions.
Every time I know that, like, I've been to the site twice now, I think, and I know that like a colleague of mine, Sharon Wilson, also visited that same compressor station in the past, and each time we've been there, we've found abnormal emissions, venting happening, or leaks, and so it's a problematic site, and a big concern there is that it's located, like you said, right across the street from where people live, and depending on the direction of the wind, the plume can push that pollution right into someone's front yard and like through their window into their house. And with the camera, you can actually see where the plume is moving. And we always try to be crosswind, not only to be able to better see the entirety of the plume, but also to avoid being directly in it. But without the camera, you don't really know if you're in the plume or not. And of course, it's constantly shifting. So that's a good reason to have setbacks. And I know it's something we've talked about, just keeping these things at a distance from where people live, because they're going to, depending on the wind, it's going to move into where somebody is living or where kids are playing. And it's got a lot of health implications over both the short and the long term.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I don't know if we can find the oil and gas mapping website, but DEP, if you Google like DEP oil and gas mapping website, you can actually see on their website where all the known, now these are just the known ones, these are not the abandoned ones that the DEP doesn't know about, right? But these are the known wells that are there, the conventional and unconventional. And so you can actually, as a resident, look to see what is near you. That way you can see how close you are to everything. And I'm going to go ahead and, great. Corey, if you wouldn't mind popping the link in the chat. I think maybe I might need to do it because we're going to give you guys the link here. And so you can look up for yourself, where that stuff is located, to see what you're near. Because I think that's the first step to knowing what is around you. And so I think this was actually a picture that I took when we were at The one was this, I can't remember if this was the well that was near the soccer field. But there were a couple locations. Do you want to talk about like our last time we were out together and kind of what we
Yeah.
found?
Yeah, I think this one might have been in Halton Road Business Center. But yeah, we went to several different locations back in November, I think it was, based on community concerns around smells, actually. Some folks had reported, as well as our own concerns about like the locations of some of these sites that we'll talk about. But I think the one that this is a picture of was the Halton Road Business Center. There's a few different sites located in this business plaza. And if we actually click on the video in the top corner, you may be able to see, some of the pollution that we captured with the camera here. It'll kind of move into it over time. But yeah, the locations of these wells were concerning to us because it's really where people live, work, and play. We talked about the compressor station right across the street from where people live. This is, people work in this business plaza. People go for walks nearby. There was like a trail close by, which I think is like how, folks had noticed the smell happening. And so, and then of course we'll talk more about Boyce Park later, which obviously that's an area a lot of people go to for recreation. And if community members hadn't reported the smell to us about this one near Halton Road Business Plaza, we might not have known about it. It might have gone unnoticed. But as we were walking up to these sites, we noticed the smell, and you could see there was something kind of like puffing out of it. This wasn't a huge leak. It was a small one, but it was continuous. And I filed complaints at both this site, and there was another site in the same business center that also had similar, leaking emissions that were happening at the well site. And in both cases, what I found out is that the equipment was loose in some way. So there's just sort of wear and tear that happens. This stuff is outside. It's sitting there for years. And so naturally, there's going to be wear and tear. Pipe fittings are going to loosen. Casing heads are going to loosen. They're going to need to be tightened. It's just like maintenance that's required. And that's what needed to happen in this case. These two sites were both owned by Penneco, and the DEP inspector reached out to Penneco and basically had to ask them to take a look at it and to tighten the fittings. In the one case, to tighten the pipe fitting that was creating this leak, and in the other case, to tighten the casing head. So just parts of the well site that were coming loose, and that if it hadn't been for us taking a look at this and someone, a community member reaching out to Protect PT about the smell, we don't know how long that would have been going on for. And these are just a couple of small examples, but it's kind of a not an uncommon thing for well sites to experience wear and tear like this and to need that kind of maintenance. Leaks are going to happen. So yeah, looks like our presentation is.
Yeah, our presentation went away. So let me try to pop it back up again. I'm not sure what happened. Hi, Corey. There's Corey. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened. That was really weird. Okay, well, we're back. And actually, if we go to the next screen, and Corey, if you wouldn't mind, there was something that we had a webinar the other day with Russell, and so I wanted to try to get the link for that so we can share with you, because we're going to talk about what Melissa was just talking about with all the like fittings and stuff. There's actually a new rule that's coming out that with the EPA that will help with some of this stuff. So we're going to mention that towards the end, and we're going to get the link for you guys if you want to reflect back and look at that whole webinar. You can, but this is the one. Actually, this is the one at the soccer field, because I see the soccer, the goal behind us. So tell us a little bit about what we're seeing in this video, Melissa.
Yeah, so this well site is actually named after the middle school property that it's on. It's an unfortunate thing, but I've now seen a number of well sites that are literally located on school properties. So this one's on a soccer field at Linton Middle School. We noticed the smell as we were walking up to it, and lo and behold, looking at it with the camera, this is a line heater, and you can see the heating element. You can see it's brightly lit, it's heated up, but there's something else happening here, which is like these emissions, this pollution that's coming out pretty steadily from this equipment. And so, and I switch modes with the camera, so you're going to see it a little more intensely here, I think. But I filed a complaint for this, submitted the video, and it turns out that they actually, DP requested the operator replace this line heater because what was happening here was not actually normal. They used a methane detection equipment, so it's something different from the camera. It can't visualize it, but it can measure methane. They used that at the site. They noted there were, excess levels of methane, and determined that this actually needed to be replaced. That something wasn't right with this equipment. It wasn't properly, staying on the whole time. They said maybe it's going in and out somehow, but this is on a school property and presumably still being used as a soccer field for kids. And so there's a lot of concern, I think, that we have about sites like this being in such close proximity to children. But there's clearly like need for regular maintenance if you're going to have a site like this in that type of a location. And it's one of those things where having the camera was extremely useful, but if you were to smell something around here, you could also file a complaint. You don't need to have the camera or to capture a video in order to file a complaint with DEP. So we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and we could really smell it. I mean, as soon as we went up to it, we could smell it. Yeah, and this was clearly a soccer field that had been used recently. I mean, there were goals everywhere. There were some off to the side where it looked like they had been moving them around next to a school. And I remember, I think it was on the last trip. Not the last trip, but the trip before you were out, we went to Trafford Middle School and Elementary School. And again, there was a well. There's a well behind the school, and it was leaking. And you had been there previously, and it was leaking in a different spot. So
and this one, it was leaking from a different spot. So it truly, these types of these sites need kind of constant monitoring. They're just not meant to be sitting out there in the elements constantly without any kind of, looking after it. It requires that based on what we've seen. You fix one thing and then the other part breaks, basically.
Right. And you can see from this picture how old that infrastructure looks. And again, I think that this is something that that new EPA methane rule addresses. This aging infrastructure, and we have so much of this around us, and we're just not sometimes aware of it. So if you're watching this, definitely go onto the oil and gas mapping website, link find wells that are near you. And if you smell something, then you'll know, there are things that I can do as a resident to help. So the next one we're going to talk about is at the Boyce Park, Monroeville plum location. So let's talk a little bit about this guy.
Yeah, so this one was pretty atrocious. As you can see, I've seen many, many, many small leaks and lots of venting tanks and things in the field work that I've done. Seeing this site, this is one of the worst things that I've seen, like directly at a wellhead itself. We smelled it. This was, off of a trail in Boyce Park. We smelled it as soon as we got on the trail, and we weren't even that close at that point. I thought, I was thinking maybe this is something, from nature, which in a way you could say that it is, but I thought it was some sort of a plant. It was not, any sort of weird sulfury plant. It was the wellhead itself was just broken open in some way. We think maybe a tree had hit it. We don't know how long it had been going on like this for, but as you can see, like from us looking at it, it was almost like someone had just opened up a hose and was letting it spray out. And so for people who are on the trail there, and we saw bikers and runners and hikers that day and kids, like if you happen to be on the part of the trail where that was blowing through, it's truly, you're just breathing it right in. This is owned by Diversified Energy. Unfortunately, we know of them as a company that is, that owns a lot of these older well sites and doesn't do the best job of maintaining them based on what we've seen in the field. And so, we have no idea how long this was going on for, but it's located right in a park, and at that point, after we captured the video, we noted the smell. We reached out to DEP and they had someone take a look right away. The operator fixed it up. There was like a part that had fallen off or something like that. So they fixed it up and it was okay. But it's a situation where if you're in a park like that and you're smelling something, you should just report it to DEP and let them investigate. You don't need to know the answer. It's okay if like you're not sure if there's actually an issue at the site. That's DEP's job, is to investigate that and identify if there's an issue. So everyone should feel very comfortable making that request of DEP.
Yeah, and I remember it smelled. I mean, we weren't even anywhere near the wellhead, and it smelled really bad coming down the hill. We're actually going to grab for you guys, and I'll put it in the chat, a YouTube link with Melissa with her respirator on, and I was there hiking with my kids, and we were looking for different types of infrastructure to try to get a video, and we thought we'd kind of bring the kids out and teach the kids how to what this technology did. And we as soon as we smelled it, went back down the hill and said, we're not going to go near this stuff because it smells too bad. It's got definitely leaking VOCs. And actually we were able to use this video and some of the work that we did that day to advocate for better protections in our parks, which was also kind of another win. I think we were successful, and so a lot of this stuff is located in parks. That maybe weren't parks, back when this stuff was built, but we're talking about 25, 50, 100 years, some of it.
This one, I don't think they even, when we looked it up in the records, there wasn't even like a clear date that they had. It might have been the 1800s. They just gave it kind of a random, like, January 1st, 1800 or something like that, when they don't know when it was actually drilled. So it's that old. So it's very possible that Boyce Park didn't exist back then. And I think it was like someone's farmland, maybe. It was named after the farmer of that location. So there's a long history to some of these sites, and they just kind of are where they are. But it's important to be aware of your surroundings and to know where these sites are located. So if you are noting a strange, abnormal, very pungent kind of odor, often, again, like kind of a sulfuric odor, that you file a complaint with DEP and have them look into it. Because it may be that you're the only person who has said anything or noticed it, and it could be going on for months before somebody else says something.
Yeah, our hopes is with this lunch and learn that other people will learn how to do this, and then will feel more comfortable, saying something. Because I know that a lot of things go unnoticed, or people think, oh gosh, that really kind of smelled weird, but not thinking, well, wait a minute, it could be impacting my health. It could be impacting climate change. Maybe those are things that are important to me, and I can do something about it. So we do have a question in the chat, and Dave asks, can you imagine FLIR technology becoming less expensive for the public to monitor?
That's a good question. And honestly, I wish that I could, but I don't have enough knowledge around sort of the development of that top technology and sort of like what the potential is to make it more affordable. But I haven't heard anything about that being a possibility. I know they make other products that are, appear, at least on the surface, to be somewhat similar, that you can like attach to your phone, for example, but they're not specifically calibrated for oil and gas. So at this point, I do not think so. But I would say there's some reason to be optimistic as a result of federal funding that's now coming in around methane monitoring and like community monitoring programs. So I'm hopeful that like maybe there will be, more grant funding available so that, not just Earthworks or like big environmental organizations can have these cameras, but like community groups as well. But I don't know if there's any reason to believe at this point that the price point is going to come down on the technology, which is pretty frustrating. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, really good question. Thanks so much for that question, Dave. And actually, this is another well that we visited in Murraysville, and a resident had told me that this had been leaking. But I don't know if anybody can see here on the picture, but literally the pipe coming out of it was bent to try to stop the methane, which I thought was kind of silly. Clearly they knew it was leaking and tried to stop it by those means. But tell us a little bit about what is in the smell, and we kind of already went over that the some of those other carcinogens that are in with the methane that are making up the smell. But
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about what's in the smell.
Yeah, yeah. We talked a bit about like the volatile organic compounds, but beyond that, hydrogen sulfide is a possibility when a well is very old. I think there's more of a chance, at least in Pennsylvania, as it gets older, for hydrogen sulfide to be a component of what comes out of the ground. But I would note here that, in my experience in reaching out to DEP about issues, they have pushed back sometimes and said it's normal for the site to smell. So, like, that on its own, sometimes they'll say it's not enough. But from my experience using this camera, anytime we've noted a smell somewhere, we have been able to find something that wasn't right. There are times where what we see are, venting emissions from a tank. And unfortunately, depending on the well pad size, that might be completely, fine according to current regulation. They're allowed to vent as much as they want from tanks at well sites that are a certain size. And so in that case, the inspector might say, we see it, but there's nothing we can do about it. But actually, many times, based on a smell and looking at it with this camera, I found things that they have had to fix. And so I would push back on that. I think it's their job to investigate it. So, like, I wouldn't feel bad about filing a complaint and they find nothing, because it's their job to make that determination. And it's better to sort of provide them with more data points to look at, rather than ignoring things and then potentially them worsening or leading to bigger problems or explosions, things like that. So I would encourage folks, like, even, not having the camera, if you're smelling something, report it. Recognize you may get some pushback initially from DEP that, like, it's normal, but they should do an inspection still. And in my experience, they do tend to still do an inspection. You may have to follow up with them, and we'll talk more about that, I think, in another slide. But, like, you might have to do some follow-up work, but they will go out and do an inspection. And they can let you know one way or the other what they found. But it's worth it to just file a complaint and let them go down that path and investigate it.
Yeah, that's right. The DEP, which if we go to the next slide, we're gonna talk about how to report to the DEP. But ultimately, this is a state agency. They are funded by the tax money that we all pay as residents of Pennsylvania, and so if they have inspectors that are, their job is to go out and inspect these sites, that's what they should be doing. And so, yeah, one thing I really appreciate about you, Melissa, is that you do follow up, and that you do, question, if they're going to give you pushback, because I feel like that we, until there's a true shift in the culture of the DEP, where they really rely and I think appreciate the residents for their contributions. We need to just kind of keep pushing back on them, and make them, hold them to their responsibilities. So tell us a little bit how we can complain to the DEP. How can we make that complaint?
So they have an online process or a process where you can call by phone. I pretty much always use the online complaint form, and then you may need to follow up by phone. Sometimes, depending on like the regional office or who's working that day or that week, you may get, like, proactively, you may get someone that calls you, because you'll submit your contact information if you're comfortable in that form. So someone may follow up with you either later that day, the next day, or the next week, letting you know they got the complaint and, like, here's the status. But oftentimes I've had to file the complaint through the form online. I'll give it a day, or I'll give it to like the next week or something, see if I hear anything. And then I'll follow up. And there is a number on the DEP website for each regional office. So you'll speak to someone who's kind of like a complaint coordinator, let them know the day that you filed the complaint, and your contact information. And they will either be able to tell you in that moment, like looking in their records, like here's the status, or they'll reach out to an inspector who the complaint has been, passed on to, and that inspector can call you back and you can have a direct phone conversation. I found that inspectors can be pretty available by cell phone to just like actually have a conversation. And some of them are very open to talking through any questions that you have, to answering any kind of concerns you have. And sometimes you'll get pushback on the complaint, or sort of downplaying what you've brought to the table, but other times they're very appreciative of you letting them know about something, and they're happy to kind of follow up on it. But you need to kind of take an active role at times in doing the follow-up yourself. But it starts with that online form or the general phone number. Yeah, we kind of noted that here. It depends on the regional office. It kind of might depend on like who's out, on vacation that week. If you're going to get sometimes an email response, I've gotten to my complaints, sometimes a phone call. But it just never hurts to follow up. If you don't hear anything, you can follow up in 24 hours. No one's going to say like, why are you calling? You can just say, hey, just want to make sure you got my complaint. Because I will note there have been a handful of times where I have filed a complaint and it's gotten lost in the system, due to what has been described to me as some sort of like a technical issue. I don't know, with the server or something. I will get a DEP email confirmation, because you should get that anytime you file a complaint with that form. You'll get a confirmation email, but even so, it didn't make its way to the right person there. And so then I've had to like file it again. So it doesn't hurt to follow up 24 hours later to the regional office and say, hey, did you get my complaint?
That's really good to know. And if folks don't know, you can go onto the DEP's website, look at what their regional office is in your area. That way you know who to call. And if you go to our next slide, you can actually also report it on the Protect PT mobile app. Anywhere in Pennsylvania, you can use this app. And one of the reasons why we made the app is because we wanted to guide people through the complaint process. And so what you can do with the app is you can actually make yourself a report of, while you're out and about or when you're home. It's not just available. So it's not available in the App Store like a normal app. It can be anywhere on any platform, on any device. And so you just go to report.protectpt.org and you follow the steps. Let's say and one of the reasons why we developed this is because, like for instance, I was out at the compressor station and I noticed a headache. Maybe I want to report a smell. I want to report health impacts all at once. And I want to be able to see that information for myself. So when you create your account here on our app, you can actually go back and look at all your reports. You can bring these, let's say you're having long-term health impacts. You can bring those to your doctor. You can print out those reports. Let's say you want to send that report to the DEP complaint. You can do that. And once you submit your report, we have a button that goes right to the DEP complaint form. So it's really easy for you to fill out that DEP complaint right from the app. So we try to kind of make a one-stop forever for all of your complaint needs with one location. So I hope folks around the state use it. It will actually populate the local places you should file complaints to based on your county. So it'll give you the information for your county and for your district for DEP. So what office are you? It'll tell you. And so we have some great comments in the chat. And so let me see. We have one from Laura. She said, we had 4 complaints called to the DEP in Delaware County a few weeks ago. Due to a strong, widespread petrochemical odor, the DEP replied it was an inversion. However, with the purple air monitors that they had, the community was able to ascertain that there was not an inversion that day, and that the air quality was overall good. So, can you give any kind of tips for residents or people that are doing that air monitoring or maybe smelling something and they get that pushback from DEP? What should they do if they get that pushback?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I will say, like, my limited experience with like filing complaints in the Southeast office has been not great in terms of like getting someone to come out and do an inspection and to follow up. That's probably, I have had less experience with that regional office than with the other ones. So I can't say like how widespread the problem is in that way, but my limited experience has not been good. So I'm not totally surprised that was the response. I would say, to keep kind of like pushing up the chain of command if possible, like figure out who you're talking to and like what their role is. And then like organizationally, can you speak to their supervisor? Can you speak to someone who's in like, if that person's in the oil and gas inspection office, can you speak to someone who's like around air quality? Like try to talk to a different person at DEP and kind of move around and see if you can find someone who's willing to be an advocate there, and to take that data and like actually have a conversation. But you may hit a wall. That's the unfortunate reality with the experience that I think many of us have had with DEP. I've had some like quote unquote success stories, in sort of limited situations with like, there's a well site, this thing is broken, an inspector comes out, they send the operator, they fix it. Of course, something else can break, like we've described, it can break a couple months later, but we've had some successes in that way. But there is, I think, a widespread problem there has existed at DEP for some time now with trying to get, real accountability and questions answered that deserve answers. I'm hoping that this next iteration of DEP that we're going to see under the Shapiro administration, that maybe there will be a culture shift. That's certainly something that like Earthworks is pushing for, that there should be more accountability to the public there. But I would say in that situation to kind of keep pushing back and see if there's someone else you can talk to there, either above that person or like laterally in like a different office.
Yeah, so I always say it's a good rule of thumb to always come at it from kindness. I've known actually DEP inspectors to say, I won't talk to that resident anymore because they were really rude to me. But at the same time, pushing back.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. If you don't get an answer from somebody, go to someone else, because like I said earlier, we as residents of Pennsylvania pay our taxes to run this agency that should work for us. And if it's not working for us, we need to call them out on it. And I think a lot of us feel that frustration, as Laura does, I'm sure, where we have done our part. We have been speaking to them, in a way that should get some type of response, and they just don't. I do find a lot of times when I'm talking to DEP folks, that these departments don't talk to each other. And so I think you have a great tip there, Melissa, that if you don't get anywhere with one department, talk to another related department. If you're not going to get anywhere with oil and gas, call someone in air. You can file. You're filing your formal complaint. I also recommend if you have a phone call with someone, follow it up with an email. Get the person's phone email that you spoke to and follow it up in writing, because at the end of the day, they can deny a phone call, but they cannot deny an email. And I'll say, per our conversation by phone, you stated X, Y, and Z, and I just want to let you know, and maybe CC their boss, or maybe CC someone up higher up in the food chain, their DEP, to let them know that you're getting that pushback and that that's not an acceptable response.
Yeah.
So I definitely, yeah, I think it's great that folks like Laura and other community groups have these air monitors and are out there advocating and watchdogging. I think one thing that I find is particularly awesome is, you know, PK and Laura. They're a group of watchdog. They're like a watchdog team, and they're out there working for their community. So we want to give a shout out to those folks. Because they really are pushing back on DEP. And, you know, I found too, sometimes they route permits to other offices
Hmm.
and complaints to other offices. So I'm not sure if that's happening there, but you know, route it to another office or you know, contact the deputy secretary or the secretary and multiple departments. So like I remember the one time I made a complaint and I think I had 5 different departments on there because it was related to oil and gas, but it was also related to waste and it was also related to air. And then I CC the secretary and the deputy secretaries and all those people, and somebody got it.
Yeah.
Somebody got it. So sometimes, you know, just knowing that you are out there advocating and you expect a response, I think is great. I see some folks chatting up in the chat. Thank you so much for all your chats. Let me see. I'm looking to see if we have any really good questions. And I want to mention, so if you guys have questions, please put them in the chat. The next thing we're going to talk about, if you want to go ahead to the next screen, is, you know, let's say at the end of the day, you're not getting anywhere. You can call Melissa, you can call other folks in the area. But Melissa, you know, let's talk about how they contact you. What if someone smells something and they can't get anywhere with DP, or they want you to come out with your gas imaging camera? How can they make that happen?
Yeah. So folks can feel free to email me. My email address is on the screen here. And you know, if you're having issues with DEP, like what you know, Laura described, where you're getting pushback, or you're not getting anywhere, and you want someone else to kind of like add to the chorus and try to like find somebody else in DEP, try to like help navigate that. I'm happy to do what I can in that way. If folks have questions about what's happened after they filed a complaint, or even if you're like struggling to like use the complaint form and you know need assistance with that, I'm happy to talk folks through that. And also to answer any questions about other types of oil and gas equipment that could be in your backyard or you know near a school or in a park near you. You know, happy to share what I have learned from my time in the field, and to talk about possibilities for conducting field work together. The fieldwork schedule for 2023 is still kind of coming together. It may be a little bit more limited in the past than in the past due to like my role as a combination of policy and field now. But we're trying to be very intentional about like planning things out even a couple months or a few months in advance and getting stuff on the calendar. So if folks are interested, we can talk through what the possibilities might be.
That's great. Yeah. And I have a question, and I'm not sure if we can answer this, but PK asks, does DEP have real-time air monitors, and is that data publicly available? That's a great question.
That is a really great question. They should have real-time air monitors. I do not know if they have DEP specific ones, and like if so, at what types of sites they would have them placed at. I have not, in my work with them, had any conversations about their own air monitors. So I'm not aware of any, but it does seem like something that you might expect them to have. So it's a good question.
Yeah, and we have another question from Dave. Can you tell the age of the well by any markings? That's a really good question.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I don't know for based on like my experience, I don't know that you can because they can actually make an old well site look pretty nice with just like a can of paint. So for example, the site, you know, in Boyce Park, it looked pretty bad when we first, you know, discovered it and found that plume there. It was rusty and like looked pretty awful. But after we filed the complaint and the operator went out and like fixed the problem, they also took the time to like paint it a beautiful shade of green and like, mowed the lawn in the area around it. So the site like looked a lot nicer and someone could see that and think it actually wasn't that old. I've also seen some sites that are like 20 or 30 years old that have been left in such disrepair that you would think that it was like 50, 60, 100 years old because it's just so like unmonitored and like poorly maintained. I'm sure that there are certain types of equipment that like, in the past they didn't have them. So you could sort of tell based on that. But even then, you can add new equipment to an old site. So even based on like newer technology being added, you might not know the actual age of when it was first drilled. So it can be tricky, but conventional well pads tend to be older and unconventional, frac pads tend to be newer. So the size of the well pad can be somewhat of an indicator in that way of, if it's a smaller conventional site, it's likely to be older, but not necessarily.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about how people can get involved and how they can, advocate for themselves and their community. We talked about commenting, we talked about filing a complaint. What else can people do to get involved?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say like, we've talked a bit about the EPA methane rule that, has been drafted, and there's a need for comments on that to try to not only, express support for increased monitoring at some of these smaller well sites, but also to ask for some additional, things that could be added to this rule that are not currently in place. For example, in Pennsylvania, at some of these smaller well pads, we have tanks that vent continuously. Sometimes, some of the worst pollution that I've seen at smaller well sites has come from the tanks. And under the current draft of the rule, the tanks can pollute as much as they want. Like there's no limit. And so that's something that we want to ask for, and it would be very helpful, to try to decrease pollution in Pennsylvania. For other folks to push for that as well if they feel like that's important to them. But also, I would say at the state level, we have a new administration in place. We have a new governor. This is a governor who put forward a really excellent grand jury report with recommendations around the unconventional industry. And so I would suggest that folks make their concerns and their support for enacting those recommendations, make your voice heard on that. Contact the governor's office, contact the folks who are at DEP now. I know they're working on staffing the office, but there's a new DEP secretary, and if there's something that you think is should be a priority under this new administration, make that known. Now is a time when I think they're going to be listening to hear what the public has to say about this stuff, and they're setting their agenda. And so it's a great time for the public to reach out and express support for changes around how this industry operates in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and I think those are some really good points. We do have some more comments about. Laura says that DEP does have air monitors that are public for that monitors public for PM 2.5, but not for VOC. And so it sounds like they might not make those results public. I'm not sure, but if they don't make them public, I would suggest doing a right to know request to DEP to get those records. And a lot of times when you do file a complaint, one of the things you can do to follow up would be to file a right to know request to find out what the documents are associated with your complaint. And that's another way you can hold the DEP accountable, because if you do a right to know request and you feel that the steps that they took to respond to your complaint weren't adequate, that's where you can escalate it and write to the DEP secretary. And I think that in general, this methane rule that we're talking about with the EPA, I think from my understanding, some of the processes that they've set up in place for this rule it will just help more. It will take a little bit of the burden off us as residents and more on the regulators and the industry, the operators. Put the burden on them to do this constant monitoring, to do the gas imaging camera for themselves and monitor for leaks and repair those leaks right away and all those things that we're talking about. But until that happens, and it could be up to 4 years,
Wow.
if you look at our webinar we had last week, you'll learn more about the methane rule. If you want to comment on it, if you go to the next slide, we actually have a comment form. There's a lot of information around the methane comment, but you can take a look on our forum and you make a comment about this regulation because, Melissa, you were talking about the administration and they're going to have to, they're going to have to do some things around this. Once the EPA finalizes it, our state will have to implement their own plan to adhere to that EPA rule. So, that could take time too, and we want to push them to do it as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. This eventually, once it gets finalized by the EPA, it does come back down to the state again. And so it's just another reason to just make your voice heard on why this is important, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level.
Yeah, for sure. And I see lots of comments in the chat, and I agree. The methane rule still, has some serious shortcomings, and we actually talk about that a little bit on our webinar. Some of the ways that it could be better, and for sure, I think people should talk about that and say, and let EPA know, like, this is a good start, but there's
Yeah.
still more work to do, and
Yeah.
we want to obviously advocate not only for the climate but for the health of the people that live around this stuff. And I think one of the things that we're talking about here in the chat, they're talking about compressors, and I know that they have like valving stations. There's
Mhm.
so much infrastructure that the oil and gas, the whole layout of getting gas from the extraction point to, which is like the wellhead, then to market. There's so much infrastructure associated with this industry, and no matter depending on where you live in the state, this infrastructure could look a lot different,
Yeah.
and so no matter where it is, DEP should be checking up on these guys, making sure the stuff doesn't leak, whether it's a compressor station. I know that there are certain circumstances that happened in the past in the East where some of the folks that are commenting live, where there was a release of stuff into the air, and the residents didn't know about it. So these are things like we need to advocate for the DEP to tell us to monitor for air, to share that information with the public, because if the monitors, if that information is not public, how are people going to make decisions for themselves about whether they should go for a walk with their dog or whether they should go for a walk with their kids that day,
Yep.
playing outside with their children. Children inhales so much more air than adults do, and their small bodies cannot filter out the toxins like adults can. So it's important when we're talking about the people that we love. We want to talk about keeping everyone healthy in our community. So yeah.
Yeah, and the methane rule, it's a good start. Like you said, there are areas where we want to see improvement, and ultimately, we know that like this is an industry that is that needs to be in decline, and we need to see a just transition to safer, cleaner energy. From my work with this camera across the state, and like I live in Philadelphia, I found a gas leak, in my own home here using the camera. It leaks truly from one end of the supply chain to the other. That's kind of how it works when you have something like methane going through pipelines, going through distribution lines, whether it's at the wellhead itself or one of the midstream locations like a compressor station, or it's a distribution main. We've had obviously issues with PGW here in Philadelphia with explosions that have happened. Or whether it's in your own home, if you have gas appliances or gas heat, It's a known fact about this industry that leaks are happening all the time. And so we want to get the best possible EPA methane rule enacted, but we know that that's also part of a bigger picture transition that needs to happen to get us away from relying on methane altogether.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. If all of these if all these facilities were carrying water, how much leak, how many leaks would we be able to view? I mean, it'd
Right.
be really clear we'd be losing a lot of water because there's so many leaks. And it's so cool that that folks like Melissa can go out with this really amazing technology and see these leaks. But you can use your nose too, and you can make those comments to DEP, make those file those complaints, follow up, all the things that we're talking about today. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and all the wonderful chats. Thank you guys so much for being involved in the conversation, because I think it's really exciting. It brings a lot of content to what we want to bring and share with you all, for people to engage like that. So I want to thank you all. I also want to thank Melissa for joining us today and coming out here. We really enjoy our time when you're here, but we get so much out of it as well. So much education, so much advocacy, and it's really great to connect with folks like you, Melissa. Thank you so much for your work today, and this whole year. We have really enjoyed working with you, and we're gonna hopefully do some really wonderful work in the future as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to continue with that. And thank you for having me. And yeah, hope it's been helpful for folks to talk through some of this stuff today.
Yeah, for sure. And so make sure you tune into our Lunch and Learns. They're always the last Tuesday of the month. And please take our survey to tell us what kind of content you're interested in learning more about. We want to make sure we're bringing content and education to the community that they care about. So thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful lunch, and we'll see you next month. Bye.
Bye.